YouTube, like go to the home page. It says preparing to live stream the webinar. All right, that looks like that's done. Then in a minute, I will do the rest, which is once I see that working. I'm going to mute that. You should be able to hear it. I think that's okay that I muted that. I don't want to hear it, but you should. Now I'm going to do something else. Just talking to myself. I'm actually going to record. And let's see, let's see what it says here. Okay, we're in good shape. I've got you. All right, after I broadcast, I'm going to record. So, I'm going to share. So we'll be on. I just want to make sure you're there, right?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, Raymond, I'm going to broadcast, and then I'll be quiet for a few seconds, and then.
Where, by the way, am I supposed? I'm on YouTube, Sharia Crime Stoppers, right?
Yeah, if you go.
I just see I'm on the home page, and
yep,
there's like a introduction video.
Click on that. You should. Yeah, we are on YouTube. Click on that, and it should open up. You should see me and the flag.
Okay.
Let me know if you do.
It just says the concealed threat of Sharia crimes.
All right. I'll do this.
It's like
go out to YouTube and take the channel is called no spaces, The United West. The United West. That YouTube channel should open, and you should be able to find the live version. It may be waiting for me to broadcast. So I'm going to go ahead and broadcast.
Okay. All right.
All right. Here we go.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. We are in the land of advanced technology. That advanced technology enables me to actually show this three-dimensional flag behind me. And tonight we've got another outstanding webinar schedule for you. As you know, these webinars allow you to ask questions. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You can click the Q&A button and type in your questions for our guest tonight, Raymond Ibrahim. I'll introduce him in a minute. Mary is not with us tonight. I'll just give you a hint. Mary is doing a parallel webinar for another one team member. And so I'm on my own tonight with your questions, but please do enter them. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen. I'm talking to myself so I don't make a mistake. Here we go. And we should be, there we go. But here we go. We're not. Hang on. It looks like that didn't work. 1 second, please. We're going to share the screen again, a little bit more careful. Hang on a second. Oh, okay, we're good. I think it's going to let me share here. Okay. Not sure why that happened. We will try it again. Okay, I'm not sure why, but let's go up here. All right. Raymond, can you hear me? Raymond Ibrahim.
Yeah, hi, Dick.
All right, well, good. And if presumably this is our first time doing all of this, so I'm going to invite Raymond. Raymond, are you able to see the YouTube by any chance?
Yeah, I do.
All right, we are golden. Ladies and gentlemen, we're having a new era here with YouTube picking up our webinar broadcast from our Zoom platform. And so people who are out in the YouTube world can watch us right now. In addition to those of you that have joined us, we appreciate your loyalty in the webinar world. But I just want to mention to you, if you have a friend or somebody, you can tell them to go to theunitedwest.org. On the homepage of theunitedwest.org is our broadcast live, right? There's a window right there. So YouTube is putting that out to the whole YouTube community of people who follow the United West channel on YouTube. Just want to give you that background. We are doing a full webinar tonight, and we have Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, good evening, and thanks for being with us, and thanks for your patience as we tried out some of this new technology.
Hi, Dick. Good to be with you. Yeah, no problem.
So I have a couple of slides that we're going to use. You're noticing right now that Raymond is not is not visual to you. He is full audio, full-throated audio, and we have a lot of information to share. It just turns out sometimes with all the technology, it's just a better way to go. And with an audio live, this is all live, I'm going to move through some PowerPoints, and we're going to have a full presentation and conversation and questions with Raymond. Raymond, I have a slide up now. I'll just touch on it briefly. For the new people, we are the United West. We are Sharia Crime Stoppers. We are one team, completely focused on the One Fight 2020. The bigger topic of World War III is part of World War III has a battle called 2020, and we look at it as a spiritual battle between good and evil. And we have a slogan at the United West, make America think again. And that's what Raymond Ibrahim and his outstanding research will enable us to do. So tonight we do have Raymond with us. Raymond is the author of the Sword and Scimitar, and the subtitle is very important, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. We are going to talk about his book, his work, his research, some recent interactions where he was at the Army War College. With that in mind, Raymond, why don't you give a little bit of background? I've got a picture right now for those of you that may be catching up on YouTube of the book, The Sword and the Scimitar. But before we do that, Raymond, why don't you give a little bit of background of your work in this space and how you came to build all of these deliverables, not just this particular one, which is your latest.
Sure, Dick. My background really goes way back, not least due to my own ethnic upbringing, being of Egyptian background, Coptic Egyptian. I was born in the United States, but my parents, both my mom and father, they were married in Egypt, and they moved here before I was born. But obviously, I grew up bilingual. I learned Arabic along with English and other languages. And naturally, because of my own personal heritage, I had an interest, obviously, in the Middle East, especially vis-a-vis the Western world. In college, I I focused on that. Actually, my degrees are in history, bachelor's and master's, and my master's thesis was actually about the first battle, the most pivotal battle between Islam and Christian Europe in 636, the Battle of Yarmouk, which actually also figures in my recent book, Sword and Scimitar. And after that, I got accepted in Georgetown University, which was, considered one of the top schools when it comes to all things Islamic and Middle Eastern. But I did well there. Every class I took, I had an A on it. But as I learned later on, I was a naive student at the time. I didn't understand the politics of colleges, political correctness, all that sort of thing. But as I learned later on, it was very antithetical to what I was trying to achieve and understand. That is the truth. Anyway, I got an internship at the Library of Congress at the same time when I was at Georgetown. And that eventually turned into a full-time job. And I worked there at the Middle Eastern Division, actually, for, I think, 7 years. And during that time, that's when I wrote my first book, the Qaeda Reader. I came across all these writings in Arabic by Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri of Al-Qaeda that had never been translated or disseminated to a Western public. And they very much contradicted what Al-Qaeda had been saying through their official communiques. So in their official communiques, they would say to the West and to America specifically that we attacked you on 9/11 because you're attacking us. This is all about reciprocity. If you leave us, we'll leave you alone. What you're doing to the Palestinians, it's unfair. You're siding with Israel. Everything that they said officially was about how Islam, how they were just doing what they were doing in retaliation. And if America would just only be objective and neutral and fair, they would stop. Now, the writings that I mentioned that I found in the Library of Congress that had never been cataloged, translated, or disseminated completely contradicted all that. They were written by young Osama bin Laden and young Ayman Zawahiri. And in a nutshell, they were saying the same things that the Islamic State or ISIS says, which is we have to hate them, Americans, infidels, on principle. We have to fight them. We have to bring jihad to them. We have to conquer them, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that was my first book, and I translated it and put that together. And Doubleday published it in 2007. There was a lot of actual media about that too, including about copyright ownership, whether it was mine or Osama bin Laden and so forth. Anyway, I eventually left and I focused full time on writing and researching right around 2008, so about 12 years ago. And since then I've been in the associate director of the Middle East Forum and other jobs. Currently, I'm a fellow at a variety of think tanks, including the David Horowitz Freedom Center, the Middle East Forum still, the Gatestone Institute. I've been with other places like Hoover Institution. Anyway, my job now is constantly to read and research and write about Islam, specifically how it's, the threats or dangers it poses to Western civilization in general, America in particular. There's a lot of material to discuss and write about from a historical point of view and a doctrinal point of view. But also to just finish up, I also wrote one of my interests, and that I think is completely lacking, is the phenomena of Muslim persecution of Christians. So I also focus on that in my 2013 book, focused on that. It's titled Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War Against Christians. And every month I actually write a report for the Gatestone Institute that compiles, the most egregious anecdotes of Muslim persecution of Christians that surface every month. And I've been doing that since June of 2011, I believe. So you're talking about almost 100 reports, each of which are about 4,000 words long, and each one covers a month. Okay, so from 2011 to now, and every single one of those anecdotes that I summarize, if it was a Christian doing it to a Muslim, would be right front and center on the mainstream news. None of these, the majority of them, don't make it to mainstream media. I get them either from Arabic sources that I translate or very small human rights organizations and so forth. So that's also a very important interest of mine that I've been continuing. And then finally, Sword and Scimitar, the book that I wrote, and really that's the topic of, I think, what we're discussing with care. So that book is titled Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. And I stress the subtitle because that's what it's about. And that really is the book that I wrote that is most based on my own interests going back to college, because as I pointed out, my master's thesis, which I think I started in 1998, so over 20 years ago, was about military history between Islam and the West. And
Raymond,
I've always found that
Raymond,
the most interesting. Yeah.
Raymond, I apologize, but we can't see each other. So let me just try to jump in for a second. Just want to make a comment here. I would suggest there's some divine intervention going on here. You went to Georgetown University, and we've talked a lot about Georgetown University. And as a student wanting to learn everything you could, you were actually in a university that had a department, perhaps the one you were in, that is funded by Saudi Arabia, right?
Prince Al-Walid Al-Talal, yeah.
Right, and then so that's a twist. And then you go to the Library of Congress and you find work written by Osama bin Laden. You do research into things that are deep into the library and you find that and you write about it. I mean, I would say there's something going on.
Well, you're not the first one to make, make that position known. And I can see it too, but, for modesty's sake, I'm not going to say that. But yeah, I've had a lot of other people point that out. But it is true. I went at the time, I didn't realize Georgetown was what it was. Yeah. And I had my experiences. And then I went into, the Library of Congress itself turned out to be a very politically correct institution that towards the end, before I quit of my own accord, was, very critical about what I was writing and publishing. And, they used to have dignitaries from the Islamic world, from Saudi Arabia especially, come and also gift them with donations.
Absolutely.
And express their disapproval of what I was doing.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, all that has a long history with me. Yeah, you're right.
Why don't you also, I think most of our attendees understand. Why don't you give a little bit of background about the Coptic Christians in Egypt? I remember talking to someone and they told me that one of the churches that they were associated with, well, there was a church, I guess, that was formed in 46, not 1946, but 46. So a little background maybe on the Coptic Christians in Egypt.
Sure. The Coptic Christians of Egypt of whom I'm counted amongst. Let's start etymologically. The word Coptic is simply means Egyptian. Okay, so our English word Egyptian is based on the Greek word, as so many of our words are based on Greek words, and the Greek word was Aegyptos. Okay, so we have Egyptian from that. Now the Arabs, when they conquered Egypt in the 640s, they took that word for Egyptian, Aegyptos, and they just took the middle part, Gipt, and it became Kipt, and now English writes and transliterates it Copt. So the word itself simply is an alternate word to the word Egyptian, except it connotes Christian. And so to be a Copt is also to be a Christian Egyptian. It's not just to be an Egyptian. And again, that's just a reminder of who the original inhabitants of Egypt were when Islam invaded the Copts. They were Christian Egyptians. So their plight is, well documented. In fact, there's a new book coming out, and I wrote the foreword to. I think it's coming out this summer, and I believe the title is a Sword Across the Nile, and it's a historical account of the Egyptian Copts' experiences under Islam from the year 640 to the present, from original sources that were translated by the author Adil Gindi. In fact, I read that book in Arabic, and I liked it so much that I encouraged Mr. Gindi to translate it, and he has. So that should be coming up for anyone who's interested, and I'll be writing about it when the time comes, when it's published. But that definitely will cover. But the long and the short of that book, as well as my book, okay, Sword and Scimitar, is that, what all the things that we're told Islam does not represent, or better yet, the Islamic State does not represent Islam. We're told. So when ISIS beheads, builds pyramids, or when it burns churches, or when it destroys whatever religious shrine that's not Islamic, or when it enslaves women and children, infidels, and sells them in slave markets, as ISIS did, we were told that does not represent Islam, right? So when you look at the history as documented in, for example, my book, Sword and Scimitar, you're going to see 14 centuries of exactly that kind of history being performed by Muslims, but this time not ragtag terrorist groups like ISIS, but actually the very heads of Muslim states, the caliphates, the sultans of sultanates, the emirs, the very top heads, including the religious or Islamic establishment of ulama, all of them spoke and acted just like ISIS, vis-a-vis, in this case, Europe. They basically said, you either convert or you pay tribute, or else we invade and we attack. And that's what they did, the latter. They invaded and attacked, starting with the Battle of Yarmouk, which I mentioned in 636. They basically took over. Well, let me just backtrack a little bit and give you some more context. In the 7th century, when Islam came on the scene, there was no West. Okay, there wasn't really even Europe in that sense. What you had was Christendom. There was one united Christian bloc, and it was basically along all the old domains of Rome, which by the 7th century had fallen. At least in the West, you still had Constantinople. Okay, so in the 7th century, when Islam came, you had all of North Africa, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor. All of that was very Christian, fundamentally Christian, much more so than Europe. Okay, more so than France and Spain and Italy and Sicily, countries that we associate with early Christianity, and certainly Germany at the time and Scandinavia weren't even Christian at that point. So Islam comes in the 7th century, and in 1 century conquers and Arabizes almost 3/4 of the original Christian world. And so Egypt, all the way from east to west, North Africa, Egypt to Morocco, all of the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and then into Asia Minor later on with the Turks. But also Spain was conquered and had an Islamic presence for nearly 8 centuries, and Muslims went as far as Tours in central France. They had a base cell in Switzerland, where for decades they would raid the villages and take slaves, fair-skinned slaves, to the markets of North Africa, slave markets, and also in the Middle East. And then later, of course, you had the Turks and the Tatars conquered Russia, and they became Muslims afterwards, and the whole Tatar yoke, and that's its own long history. But of course, the Turks went into the Balkans, conquered it, and depending which country, some were there, some were under Islamic control for centuries. And as late as 1683, You had them going and reaching Vienna with an army of 300,000 people as late as that. And then, America, its very first war, before it could even elect its first president, George Washington, before it could formally be formed as a nation, was with Muslims. And we know them as the Barbary Wars. But if you really look at, what was behind it and what was happening, it was the same old story as when Thomas Jefferson met with the ambassador from Barbary and said, "Why are you attacking our American vessels, enslaving our sailors, et cetera, et cetera?" And the man simply replied that it's our religion and our prophet and our book, the Quran, tells us to do this because you're infidels and you have to come under our authority. And these raids, by the way, went as far as Iceland, as far as Denmark, as far as other parts of Scandinavia and England and Ireland. And slaves were being taken out from all these places for centuries, really. So you have this going on century after century. You have Europe, being essentially all of what its identity, Europe's identity is fundamentally associated to this long jihad we're talking about because, as I said, there was really no Europe. You had Christendom, and most of it was in the Middle East and North Africa. So what Europe became was the westernmost final bastion of Christendom that did not capitulate and was not conquered by Islam. And today we call it the West in relation to what? To Islam, because it was the westernmost region that Islam did not swallow up. It's very telling when you look at the borders of Europe and you see all around it are Muslim nations. The reason for that is because those Muslim nations used to be Christian nations. And, that's why the border is all Islamic, because it was continually closing in on Europe proper until, finally Europe, emerged triumphant, especially during the colonial era and so forth. So this is really the backdrop and the context and the history of what's going on. You were asking me about the Copts. So that's how the Copts fit into all this. They were, when you look at them, they are their life and experience is a microcosm of what I'm talking about, which is just literally 14 centuries of jihad. That's why a nation like Egypt, which was considered fiercely Christian in the 7th century and probably the most populous one around, that's why, the Roman persecutions, especially under Diocletian, were mostly against Egyptians, the Copts. And then Islam comes in, and now they've been reduced from almost 100% to 10%. Well, how did that happen? Is it because they just of their own free accord decided to become Islamic because it was the greater religion? No, we know how that happened, and you'll see it in the history because it was what ISIS did, what all these groups did. So really, the history is ironclad, and it is what it is, and that's why a lot of groups and people and groups like CARE were adamant about suppressing it.
So let me, by the way, we have a question already. We might as well get it out of the way. So the question has to do with the Roman Empire or Christianity in Rome versus Egypt. I think we've already answered the question. Basically, Egypt had Christianity as early as 46 AD. Maybe there's another date, but as we know, the Roman Empire was not Christian until, I believe, sometime in the 300s when the emperor was converted and said everybody's going to become a Christian. So Egyptian Christians predate the Roman and the Pope, of course. So, but even today,
not just that.
Yeah,
not just that. As a matter of interest, not just that, but so you had 5 original historic Christian sees or centers, and one was in Alexandria, and one was in Rome, and the others were in Antioch and Jerusalem, and then much later Constantinople. But really, the oldest were Alexandria and Rome and Antioch. And what's interesting is the only one of those, the only patriarch or the head of those 5 that went by the word Pope was the Coptic Pope. And it was only later that the Roman patriarch was called a pope. And that's why till today, you have various Orthodox patriarchs around, but you have only 2 popes. And one's the Catholic Pope and one's the Coptic Pope.
Interesting. So, by the way, it looks like some people maybe are raising hands, and I should have turned that off. We aren't going to be able to respond to raised hands. The best way to do this is to enter a question in the Q&A button, and that will be the way we'll be able to deal with questions tonight. So just a little bit more focus. I would suggest, and Egypt is a great example. I think you said that, of 14 centuries of war. I mean, the Egyptian Coptics are still under siege. If I understand it right, there are churches still burned, attacked in Egypt to this day. Is that the case?
Yes, they're attacked and burned by anything from Muslim mobs who don't want a church in their neighborhood, or by Islamic terrorists who end up with a very spectacular attack that claims the lives of dozens. There have been several of those, or it's the actual government itself which creates so many hurdles and red tape for Christians to actually not just build a church, but to actually even renovate a church, or even to use a private residence as a place of worship. The government will be the one that steps in and actually prevent that.
So we're better than we were with Morsi, but even with El-Sisi, it sounds like the government is still extremely pro-Muslim, pro-Islamic, and makes it difficult, or looks the other way when Christians are abused and attacked. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's fair. It comes to the person of Sisi. I have ambivalent views about him. He said a lot of excellent things and very progressive, open-minded things. And it's not necessarily that I think he's a hypocrite. I honestly think he's just stuck between a rock and a hard place. And if he were to push for the sorts of reforms that would see equality brought to the Copts, that would be a political blunder on his part. And, the Islamist factions would use it against him to expose him as, he's a sympathizer of the infidels, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't want to enforce Sharia law. So I think that plays a big part of it. He can't change the culture or the society, so he just goes along.
Well, that's interesting how complicated the Middle East is, period. And large, even when you have a dictator, or I don't know that we would call him a dictator, we have the complexity of keeping somebody in office so that it doesn't get worse, so they don't put another Morsi in. Let's go back to the book. So it's 1,400 years. If I understand it right, you've got the first battle in detail based on research, and then you move through battle after battle after battle with quite a bit of detail. Is that the structure of the book? Is that if you were laying it out?
Yeah. The book is basically, I started it off by ascertaining what I thought were the 8 most significant or decisive battles. And so you have 8 chapters. Each one is about one battle. But the bulk of each chapter isn't really the battle, because there's only so much that can be written, especially when you focus on primary sources the way I mostly did. So really the bulk of each chapter is the background, the build up to the battle, and then what happened after the battle, and what some of the significant aspects were. So it's 8 battles, 8 chapters. When we start, the first battle is the Battle of Yarmouk, which, as I said, that was the thesis that I wrote for my master's degree in history back in the late 90s. But it's not just a copy and paste. Actually, the chapter of the Battle of Yarmouk in the book is, I think, much better. I did new research. I added more interesting information, and I deleted a lot of academic, sort of boring information. And then it goes from that battle in 636. I can actually name them real quick. The Battle of Yarmouk's first one, second one is the siege of Constantinople, which I'm not going to say who won or lost. I don't want to ruin it for anyone, but there's a second siege of Constantinople, is chapter 2. Chapter 3 is the Battle of Tours. Chapter 4 is the Battle of Manzikert. Chapter 5 is the Battle of Hattin, Crusader battle. Chapter 6 is the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, which is the most pivotal battle in Spain, and that's a very underappreciated chapter of Islamic Christian struggle. And it's a very, Spain really does represent a microcosm of the perennial jihad on the Christian world. And then chapter 7 is the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the siege of Constantinople. And chapter 8 is we mentioned the siege of Vienna in 1683. But I also mentioned a lot of lesser battles, lesser in significance. For example, as I mentioned, the Barbary Wars are in there, and that's in 1800, much after, the Battle of the Siege of Vienna. And like I said, so you'll see the battles, and from the primary sources, lots of it is actually translated by myself from original languages because it's just not available. And you also see the context. And like I said, the grand lesson of it all, usually military history is fascinating in and of itself, but it's often academic, reading about Alexander the Great fighting with, Darius. It's not going to teach me anything really, other than it's a good story. But when you read these battles, there is a lesson. And the lesson is that the things that we're seeing happening today in the name of Islam are not aberrations. They're actually continuations of what Muslims have been doing for almost 14 centuries. And like I said, the book documents it. It has well over 1,000 citations and endnotes to, the original sources that I'm quoting from, most of which are very academic, well-regarded sources. So I think it's hard to read this book. And I've seen reviews and people have contacted me, and this is one of the things that makes me happy. It's not so much people who already know this and then they like it, which is great. But I've gotten a lot of people who are clearly left-wing, liberal, pro-Islamic, who've written to me and just said, you know what, this has really changed my views. I still don't like what you're saying, but at least I'm going to investigate it. And because it's hard for me to argue against all the sources, this vast array that you've marshaled and presented. So at least I'm going to do my own research. So that to me, I think is a great victory, because it at least teaches people that there's more to it than meets the eye, and you should at least look into it. You don't have to take my word if you don't want to, but do your own research, because it's an important topic, and it's one that's still playing out today, though most people are unaware that it's happening, and certainly unaware that it has any continuity with what happened in the past.
Well, you mentioned sources. I think we better go over this real quick. What languages do you speak? I'm assuming these are sources in the languages that we would never get into. What languages did you draw from that you're able to do your research in?
Well, I'm fluent with Arabic, so that right there. But I also can do research. I did some translations from Greek, so I can read, especially Koine and Byzantine Greek. I've studied for almost 20 years. And I did train in, there's a lot of these battles and a lot of our sources come from Greek writings, actually, but also Latin, which I know very little of, but I actually did have some people help. And there are some original translations from Latin documents that are in the book. And I also did some, supplementing. I learned a lot of these languages, or was able to do a lot of research where I worked at the Library of Congress for all those years, because I worked in the it was called African and Middle Eastern Division, and it housed all the books that were written in Persian, Turkic, Arabic, also Armenian, and some other languages. So I definitely knew I can do research in those languages, though not all the time. I wouldn't necessarily translate from them, but I would be able to ascertain something important enough to actually get someone to translate it for me professionally. So the long and short of it is the book definitely has a lot of items that either have never been translated, or at least not to my knowledge. I couldn't find it. So I did it, or I had a colleague do it, or more often than not, it's just stuff that just isn't out there anymore. A lot of the things that I translate are from musty old books that do exist in English, but people don't even know about them, let alone read about them.
Well, I guess I'll just go back and repeat what I said. I think the fact you could have gone to school at NYU or somewhere else where you wouldn't have been maybe getting an assignment or a job at the library. The Library of Congress is enormous. I used to I did a little bit of work there when I went to high school right near there. It's an amazing building. There's nooks and crannies. I mean, the fact that you were in this building where people would be collecting books that nobody might ever open, whether they were in English or another language, they're dusty, right. They're there, and you were there with that energy to go do that.
And that's the story of the Al-Qaeda Reader, and me finding that, because I'm something of a little bibliophile. I like books and I like languages, and I was like the proverbial kid in a candy store, because I had access to what you had to be an employee to have access to what I was able to access, and I had just bins and bins and shelf loads of oftentimes uncatalogued documents written in languages that virtually no one was able to read. So that's always been my interest and my hobby. And from the beginning, and it helped me do the Al-Qaeda Reader, and it also definitely helped me with this book, because I think a lot of people, there's a lot of facts that we know that are important, but there's even more facts that you'd be surprised how few people know, and that was one of the driving motivations for me to write this book, Sword and Scimitar. It's just that so many people are unaware of these facts, and they're very pivotal to understanding the world we live in and what's happening today.
So I think people we love to recommend action items. Obviously, an action item we're going to talk about, say right now, is this book. The book is an action item. I believe it's available in audio. I think the picture on the right says there's an audio version read by a person, if that helps you. But the book itself's got the cover on my left. But
let me just supplement what you're saying, and really to cap it off about this book. What I think really makes it important for anyone who's more interested in the now and in activism, which is all, of course, very important. Because of course, on the surface, this seems just purely academic. But why it's important is, up until now, most people make the argument against Islam is always a doctrinal argument. What they do is they'll tell you, look, Muhammad or the Quran says X, Y, and Z, and Muhammad said in the Hadith X, Y, and Z, and it's all bad, and it's all negative, it's jihad, it's misogynistic, whatever, right? And I think that's very valid, and I myself have done that. The only problem with it is, we live in this postmodern mentality where, if you show old scriptures to someone and say, hey, see, this is proof, they will dismiss it out of hand, and then they'll rely on analogies, and they'll say, well, look what the Bible says, look at the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures, look what Joshua did, genocide, et cetera, or look at all these outdated, laws, and, how come you Christians don't follow it, et cetera. So I think a lot of people in their mentality, they have in the background, they don't care if a holy book says this or that, because they know so many people, including of their own religious persuasion, don't take it literally. And so I wanted to sort of sidestep that question and just say, well, let's put away the doctrine, let's put away the Quran and the Hadith, and just see what Muslims have actually done to and in the West from a historical point of view, which is admittedly much harder than quoting the same dozen, Quran verses that everyone knows now. And I think that's why it's important, because you can argue against the Quran says this, Muhammad says this, so, well, one interpretation says that, but you can't argue facts, okay, as recorded by history. And by the way, most of the sources that I quote from, a lot of them are actually Islamic. Okay, so they're the ones who are saying that they committed X, Y, and Z atrocity and are boasting about it in their books and their histories. So that's why I really think it's important to, understand that it's one thing to criticize Islam from a doctrinal point of view, and it's legitimate, like I said, in my opinion. But it's, I think, a stronger thing to criticize it from a historical point of view, because it's really unwavering and it's just black and white. It's not about, oh, well, the Bible, this book said, the Bible says this, Quran says that, and the believers believe whatever they want. So I think that's important always to keep in mind when it comes to these topics.
And there is a model here. I think, we could give a repeated pattern that's important. One of the lessons to learn from each of these battles is that, if I'm not mistaken, the brutality was so excessive that the village down the road that had yet to be attacked got word, oh my gosh, these people are coming. They don't just win a battle. They typically don't take male prisoners. After they win, they could put you in some detainment. They kill you. By the way, the women are considered booty and sex slaves, etc. I'm assuming there's a repeating pattern, which also comes through the actions from one battle to the other are similar. Is that fair?
That's fair. And, for brevity's sake, the simplest way to put it is just recall all the things that groups like Islamic State and other groups, Boko Haram, all these Islamic organizations that we've been assured have nothing to do with Islam. Look at all the things that they did. Okay. So the massacres, the atrocities, the sadistic torture, remember they burned a man alive and so forth, the mass slave markets of women and children, the bombing and burning of churches and other religious places of worship. So think of all that, okay? And that's the blueprint that was done, but on a much greater and exponential level, because like I said, it wasn't no-name terrorist group that's hiding in the mountains. It was the actual caliphs or the caliphates. It was the sultanates. It was the heads of states. It was the great empires that were doing this on a much larger scale. And moreover, when you look at, it's important to hear and to really just to really emphasize what I'm saying about the Islamic State. So much of what they did and said was intentionally patterned after what the Muslims of history said and did. So I'll give you one example. In the Battle of Yarmouk, chapter 1, so now we're in the year 636, nearly 1400 years ago, you have one of the Islamic heroes known as Khalid bin al-Walid, or Saif Allah, which means the sword of Allah. He was a pretty brutal fighter, and he was the head of the Islamic detachment during this battle, or one of them. And when he met with the Christian general to parley, and the Christian general wanted to give him money and just basically say, here, take what you want and just leave, Khalid said, you're mistaken. We have tasted Christian blood and find none sweeter, and we have come here to kill you and drink it. Okay. And before that, also, he gave them the 3 ultimatums, convert to Islam or become a dhimmi and pay tribute, etc., which they rejected, the Christian Byzantines. So now, fast forward 1400 years later, and the Islamic State in several communiques have sent things saying, we've tasted, fill in the blank, European blood or American blood, and find none sweeter, and we've come to cut it or to draw it. Or also, I remember Al-Qaeda and others saying, you love life as much as we love death. All of those come from Islamic warriors, mujahids, jihadists throughout history, and ISIS knows that and is quoting it, and yet virtually no one in the West understood where they're drawing their inspiration from. So, if anything, ISIS is so intentionally and almost artificially patterned after the modus operandi of Islamic jihad throughout history. And if you want to know what happened historically, aside from what's in my book, just look at what ISIS has said and done, and that's exactly what Islam has said and done over the course of many centuries to Europe, to the point that 3/4 of it, as I was saying, was conquered in the name of Islam. And today, we forget that. We forget that Egypt was more of a Christian nation than Italy or all of North Africa, Carthage and these places, or Constantinople, all these areas that were seized and violently conquered by Islam. Now, all of a sudden, they're just randomly, the part of the Muslim world. And, about the Copts, going back to that, whenever I talk about Coptic Christians in Egypt being persecuted, or any indigenous Christians, Assyrians, for example, in the Middle East that are being persecuted, one of the reactions that I get from people is, we feel bad for them, but honestly now, why would they go and willingly live amongst Muslims? And again, it just shows you the ignorance that they don't understand. That's their original land. They're the original people of the Middle East, these Christian groups that are being slaughtered right now. Yeah.
So let's just a little bit more. The book is so rich. I just want to jump ahead. So we mentioned the Ottoman Empire just briefly. That's a massive story. And now we have this gentleman named Erdogan in Turkey who wants to be, if I understand it right, he wants to be the caliph of the caliphate. Just give us a quick understanding, if you would, when we hear about Erdogan being the head of Turkey, and then we know there are mosques, massive mosques in America that are funded by Turkey. What should we assume? How do we relate to somebody like Erdogan in the notion of the caliphate? What is it that he wants historically?
Well, it's a good question. It's a good question, and it again very much fits into the paradigm of what I'm discussing. That what they say and what we understand are so different. So someone like Erdogan is very well steeped and appreciates his Turkish Islamic history. And he has frequently made allusions. And again, they're the sorts of things that he would say, just like ISIS, that we don't understand, or it just sounds like some generic nostalgic statement or just some weird thing that he's saying. But it's intentionally picked up from the sultans of the Ottoman Empire and also before the Seljuk Empire. And it's in accord with that thinking. And if you knew how that thinking truly was, the way, the full extent of it, you'd understand the purport of what Erdogan is saying. So I'll give you another quick example. Osama bin Laden, after 9/11, would send messages to the Americans that would start off by saying, I'm trying to recall, but it was a formulaic statement that it turned out it was something that Muhammad used to also say. And it was basically, it was peace to whoever follows guidance. And then the rest of his explanation, or basically what is guidance, what he meant by guidance, was what I was saying, basically that America started it and it needs to stop. And so guidance would seem to mean just stop hostilities against Muslims and we'll stop attacking you. But if you go back to the original, Muhammad sent to the Roman Emperor Heraclius. He sent him a letter which started off saying peace to whoever follows guidance. But then Muhammad goes on to explain what that means. Following guidance meant submit to Islam and convert or become a dhimmi, a third class citizen, whatever, or fight to the death. So here again is an example of what happens if you understand these subtle references in innuendo that modern day Muslims make when you trace it back to its historical origins. Usually means something really bad and a lot worse than we think. So that's what, but everyone, all these American media, I recall, after 9/11, were quoting Osama bin Laden, saying, "Oh, look, he's being nice. He wants us to follow guidance. He doesn't want us to be evil and mean to Muslims and so forth." All the while, he was signaling to Muslims that he was really threatening jihad and getting praised for that because they understood what he was saying. So it's the same with Erdogan. It's the same with all these other Islamic leaders who put on suits and shave and look, for all intents and purposes, Western, and they say these things that actually have double meanings to Western audiences and to Muslims.
So this is a consistent 1400-year pattern, but there are things that have changed on the receiving end of this. If you would do us the honor of turning to page 296, there's a couple of paragraphs we'd like for you to read that kind of help wrap up this part of the segment on the book. If you've got that handy, could you read that to us?
Yeah. Is it where it starts off with "Once Upon a Time"?
I'll let you pick where it starts.
All right, on page 296, because I know you mentioned this to me before, and I think that's what you referred to.
Yeah.
So once upon a time, the Islamic world was a superpower, and its jihad an irresistible force to be reckoned with. Over 2 centuries ago, however, a rising Europe, which had experienced more than 1 millennium of Muslim conquests and atrocities, eclipsed and defanged Islam. As Muhammad's civilization retreated into obscurity, the post-Christian West slowly came into being. Islam did not change, but the West did. Muslims still venerate their heritage and religion, which commands jihad against infidels, whereas the West has learned to despise its heritage and religion, causing it to become an unwitting ally of the jihad. Hence the current situation. Islamic jihad is back in full vigor, while the West facilitates it in varying degrees. Hence the irony, and I go on to quote a historian who writes, quote, "At a time when the military superiority of the West, meaning chiefly the USA, over the Muslim world has never been greater, Western countries feel insecure in the face of the activities of Islamic terrorists. In all the long centuries of Christian-Muslim conflict, never has the military imbalance between the two sides been greater, yet the dominant West can apparently derive no comfort from that fact." And in last sentence, in short, if Islam is terrorizing the West today...
What's changed is... Go ahead. Yes, please.
So yeah, the last sentence of the book, basically, in short, if Islam is terrorizing the West today, that's not because it can, but because the West allows it to. For no matter how diminished the still swinging scimitar will always overcome a strong but sheathed sword. And so the point of that was to say the great difference between the past and the present is Islam in the past was militarily, historically very powerful, oftentimes, if not as powerful as Europe, even more powerful. And when it was, it always went on the offensive. And the Europeans and the Christians of the time actually did fight back. What's different now is Islam is very weak and very weak compared to the West. And yet the West, because it's lost its own identity and has become Islamophilic in nature, and if anything, it prefers Islam to, its own heritage. And by the way, I don't know of any other society or any other culture that hates its own heritage as much as what you see in the West. Okay, Muslims, no matter how bad their own leaders were, will always praise them. Chinese, every other civilization you can think of, but in the West, where the leaders of Western civilization did much good. Okay, I mean, look at slavery real quick. So Islam, everyone engaged in slavery, but it was the West that abolished it, both in its own home and elsewhere. It forced Muslims to stop slavery up until very recently, which was still going on, and it's still going on underground in various Muslim cultures. Okay, and yet Western people of today hate their own forebears while praising everyone else. And this is an anomaly that I have not seen in any other culture, and it's what's responsible for what we're talking about. And that quote I read which is now you have the West itself going out of its way to empower an inherently weak Islam to continue terrorizing it. And that's what you see in Europe, with this, opening their gates to, millions of Muslim migrants who, depending on how many there are, you're going to see lots of crimes. Sweden, I think its rape statistics have grown by like 1,500% since they started taking in Muslims. Same thing in Germany, UK. You got the grooming, sexual rape gangs going on. In France and other places, I think churches are attacked and vandalized at a rate of 2 a day, most of them by Muslim migrants. And so, this is the difference. The war has never stopped in the eyes of Islam. What has happened is the West has changed and has gone from actually defending itself and being proud of its own heritage and zealous over it to just doing anything it can to help, either implicitly or explicitly, the Islamic cause.
So the sword is sheathed. I think that's a powerful message after all of this information about all of these battles, very consistent behavior, warlike. The sword of the West is sheathed. And I think if you look at what Europe and Canada and the United States, so here we are, let's make believe, we're going to move on to the next kind of segment. Here we are, I'm a military guy. I've been in the military for some time, I'm a mid-level officer. I'm going to go to the Army War College and learn something. And while I'm at the Army War College, what will I learn? Much of what you've just talked about was the topic that you attempted to get across a scheduling of at the Army War College. And why don't you tell that story a little bit? I want to show, this is just a picture of those that may not have seen you. We did not have video. This is Raymond in conversation, presentation, lecture mode. And give us a little bit of information now. We've got the situation where you were going to speak at the Army War College. What happened? Tell us that story, please.
Sure, Dick. So I was invited to speak at the Army War College about my book, Sword and Scimitar, about that topic, 14 Centuries of War between Islam and the West. And I was invited, I think, back in January of 19, and I was supposed to talk. Everything was set for June. I was going to come out in June. And then 1 week before it, or maybe 2 weeks before it, CARE and a lot of other Islamic activist organizations, including Linda Sarsour, and also left-wing groups, petitioned the college and started essentially complaining. One CARE petition was hysterical, and it was basically presenting me, a man of ethnic Egyptian background, as a white supremacist and a white nationalist who, if given a chance to speak, will radicalize an already racist war college, that's what they said, into basically shooting and killing Muslims around the world and in the streets of America. I can even send you that petition, it's still out there. Anyway,
you're a white supremacist. Let's repeat that. You are a white supremacist. How about that?
Right. Yeah, because if you say I know, and see, I think they do it. It's a knee-jerk thing. They'll use it against anyone. But in my case, they just didn't really think ahead and think, oh, well, this guy's, he's actually of Middle Eastern extraction. Maybe that won't work. Anyway, they still threw it. And something worked, because the War College actually canceled my June talk right before it, a week ahead. But they said they're not canceling it. They said we're postponing it, and that it has nothing to do with CARE. It's just a coincidence that, 1 week before CARE started protesting and that they basically pulled the plug on it. Anyway, long story short, not long story short, what happened is, unlike other times when CARE does this and a college or whoever pulls a plug, this got some traction on the media. And I am grateful to the places, and I'm actually planning on writing about what happened more fully and who they were. But a number of places came into my support, including media that reported on it. Not the big ones, it wasn't Fox News and these places, and also the National Association of Scholars, which is the membership of which is made up of academics and professors in a variety of universities across America, wrote an open letter that was signed by 5,000 people, its members and also the public, denouncing the War College's decision, and sent it to the White House, to Donald Trump. And also, I think 10 congressmen submitted a letter to the War College also denouncing that they had canceled it. So anyway, after that, and other people had written, what I understand, thousands of people ended up contacting the War College by emails and phone calls at the height of this. Anyway, make a long story short, they very eagerly started inviting me back again. And I went and I finally spoke last month, February 26th, actually. And again, right before that, because they advertised it, CARE again started attacking me. They started calling the War College. They spoke to the head of the War College and the provost, and they kept telling them to cancel. But this time, the War College did not cancel, based on, I think, precedent what had happened earlier. What they did actually is they brought someone else. So I spoke, but before I spoke, they brought an Islamic history professor, John Voll, from Georgetown University, going back to Georgetown University.
Really?
And I actually, what's funny about John Voll and my history with Georgetown is I actually sat in on a class that he had, and I just, all I remember, we're talking about over 20 years ago. All I remember is, he was saying a lot of what to me seemed like nonsense. And I just asked him like what turned out to be apparently a contentious question. And I don't remember what I had asked him or what my observation was, but I do remember he just answered me very curtly and just gave me the dirtiest look. Anyway, they brought him out as a counter, so that was one of the War College's sort of appeasement. Instead of just having me speak alone, they brought him out before me to give like a different view, which I actually dismantled in an article that will appear on my website probably tomorrow, his view. Anyway, so it went well. I came back thanks to all the people who made an uproar about this. And thanks to CARE, the room was packed. From what I understand, it was as many as 300 people. I heard one of the organizers say that the only other Army War College event that outnumbered mine was Buzz Aldrin. And again, I'm not trying to show off because it's not about me. It's because what CARE did. CARE created so much controversy. What happens when you tell someone, don't read that book or don't listen to that guy? Well, they go and read the book and they listen to that guy. So CARE inadvertently created so much publicity, and it was a very packed room. And I think it went well, and it was videotaped. And my understanding is the War College will be releasing it eventually, maybe in a couple more months, and I'll be posting it on my website, the actual lecture itself. So it went well, and the lesson, there's various lessons. One is how influential a group like CARE, which, as you know, has a very dubious background and is the unindicted co-conspirator of the largest Islamic terror finance case, Holy Land Foundation. And yet here they were able to bully the War College into canceling something that, if it wasn't for the response of concerned American citizens, as I mentioned, some of them, the National Association of Scholars and Congress made it a point in their letter to say that they're responding on behalf of, the people in their constituency and so forth. So if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't have talked a second time or the second opportunity. So it just shows you how influential this group is. Thankfully, all's well that ends well in this case. And like I said, if anything, they created more, their controversy made it a packed event. So, that's a good thing. But and also what I learned and what I knew actually, and this goes back to the topic of my book, Sword and Scimitar, is they do fear. See, they're smart enough, CARE and the Islamic activists are smart enough to understand that the historical argument needs to be suppressed. Because, like I said, people can attack the Quran or what Muhammad said, but there is a way of getting out of it. I'm not saying the way of getting out of it is legitimate, but it happens to comport with the sort of relativistic mindset of the modern world. But when you look at history and you get an unwavering line of violence from a variety of people, from Arabs and Turks and Tatars or Mongols and Berbers and Moors and anyone and everyone, all these different languages and groups and geographies and nationalities, and the only thing they had in common is Islam, and they all talk and act like ISIS. I think that's so much harder for groups like CARE to suppress and dissemble that argument, and I think that's why they really came out in full force to try to shut me down about talking. But like I said, thankfully, in the end, they failed.
Well, thank God it did work out. Keep in mind that this is the Army War College. These are people that are being trained in the art of war, strategy, tactics. These are the leadership people. For them to have had this topic, maybe not as complete as your book, but this topic removed from their training back in 2012, and have 7, 8 years of not being able to speak about Sharia or jihad, and now you show up. So I mean, to me, this is a major breakthrough. So my curiosity, what was the reactions? Were there interesting questions? Did you get anybody from the audience that in a military uniform that took umbrage with what you said, or how did it go?
Well, so first, all the major, the head of the War College, Major General Kem, Kem, and the provost, I think it's Beckenridge, his last name, and all the top heads were the same people that CARE contacted, and also the people who wrote to or contacted on my behalf, like the National Association of Scholars and congressmen. The two men that everyone was reaching out to were there, present. They spoke to me. They were very nice, cordial. They sat front center, and they sat for the duration of my talk, which went over. I was supposed to be done in 45 minutes. I think I spoke for over an hour. So they were there, and and one of them was continuously nodding in approval. I could see it because they're right in front of me with everything I was saying. So that was a good sign. The questions, there was, it was moderated, and I think whoever was asking was picked. There were a couple of questions that I suppose one was the only one that, was from a Muslim who identified himself as a Muslim, who stood up. It was an African-American man. And he said, I'm a Muslim. And he started off by saying, this isn't a question. It's just a statement. And he basically went off about how, well, instead of reading about history, go hang out with a Muslim and you'll see that they're nicer. And then, another person asked me a question, which was, I don't know, when the video comes out, you can see them and see my responses. But I think the responses were good because one of the people who was there and wrote an email, which I published on my website with her permission. She's a retired lieutenant colonel in the Navy, and she was there. And her reaction was, it was great. And even the questions, she said, were ridiculous and easily answered by me. So I think it went overall very well. It's hard for me it was open to the public, so I can't really determine how many people were military or not. For example, the woman, the retired, or the woman who I do know for a fact, along with the retired lieutenant colonel, there were other people, and they were in plain clothes. So even the heads of the War College, I think they were also in plain clothes. So it was hard to tell who's who, and it was open to the public. So obviously, a lot of the up to 300 people that were there, I think the majority were probably just regular people from the area who came. But I'm also sure that there were a lot of military students there as well.
Did you get any feedback officially or any requests to take this message to another government agency, another part of the military or the Department of Justice or the FBI, basically given all the attention on this and your delivery of a fact-based, battle-based, law enforcement kind of thing? Any other contacts because of this with law enforcement? Before and after and during this event, but I'm really not at liberty to go into details. I'd say it's good news, and it's definitely reflective of more interest from people in official capacities that want to learn more about this. Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to put in perspective how significant this was, that you were there, and it's the quality of your scholarly work that, again, let's maybe thank anybody in the audience who helped ring a bell. It worked.
Yeah.
So that's congratulations on that. We'd like to just spend a little bit of time with a couple of other parts of your work and your articles. And if we can do that, then we'll get to the Q&A. So we appreciate people. Again, it's the Q&A button if you want to ask a question. We have a few in the queue. Let's look at this. Well, here is an interesting point. I guess there's leftists in the Army Journalist Corps. This is an article, if you could see the title, Raymond. The Army Times defends terrorist-linked care. So this is another part of the military complex, I guess. This is a private organization?
Yeah, I can summarize this to you. And anyone interested in, I see it right now on you have it up, the Army Times Defense Terrorist Linked Care. You can look it up. It's on front page. It's on my website and other places, or you can just Google the title. It'll show up. But the long and short of it is the Army Times is one of the oldest publications that serves the military. I think it was founded around 1940. It's one of the most prestigious, or used to be. And I spoke to a reporter. He contacted me about all the controversy surrounding my upcoming my talk at the War College last February. He called me a couple of days for the actual event in February 26th, and he asked me all these questions, and he quoted from CARE and so forth. And I kept stressing to him and telling him, and I even sent him documentation, actual letters from the Department of Justice, saying that CARE is, its background, that it's an unindicted co-conspirator, et cetera, et cetera. And I did that because he kept telling me, look, I'm going to quote what you said, and it's not going to be very friendly towards you, but I have to be transparent. And, you said this, you said that. He found stuff on my website. And I was like, fine. But if you want to be transparent, I think you should at least tell people that this group, care what they are. But he didn't. And the article came out, and the title of it, if you look it up, the article he wrote is American Muslim Activists. Okay. I mean, he calls them CARE in the body, but he didn't in any way, shape, or form connect the fact that while he brought everything he could find against me, okay, he did not say at least that CARE is an unindicted co-conspirator. Okay, he dropped that out. So I thought that was interesting. And long story short, I did a little investigating, and then I found out that the Army Times, a month or two right before this report was written about my events at the War College, had hired a new editor-in-chief who's a rabid feminist, and who constantly used to tweet how she hates Donald Trump. Okay, literally verbatim, I hate Donald Trump. So that's the head of the editor of the Army Times. So that made sense to me, because the reporter himself, I later contacted him about why would he not, if you want to be transparent, why don't you mention CARE's terror links? And I remember he told me, it's not up to me, it's up to my editor. And if you want, I can forward you to her. So that's, I kind of made it, that all made sense in the end to me.
So this is on the website, which is RaymondIbrahim.com, correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
So all these, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes on each story. I want people to understand, if they go to RaymondIbrahim.com, they will follow your work. And so let's just look at a couple of recent articles, and maybe you could just annotate them briefly if you could. This one is
Sure.
critically important: sex slavery and Islamic sacrament? ? Why don't you give, in the context of battles and sex slaves, why don't you give us a quick idea of what this was about?
Sure. So the lead of this article, the whole point is what's happening in Europe, in places like the UK and Sweden and Scandinavia in general, Germany. How Muslim migrants are basically sexually victimizing the indigenous women of Europe. I started off by quoting what a lot of them have said, and it's basically, let me here's a quote, for example, of a Muslim man raping a 12-year-old non-Muslim girl, and he tells her that it's because she, quote, practiced a religion other than Islam, and therefore the Quran not only gives him the right to rape her, but it encourages him. And so the long story short, I look at various anecdotes of Muslim men saying the same sort of thing. But then I say, well, is this just them, or is this something in Islam? And I also quote ISIS, who actually published the whole pamphlet, excerpts of which I quote in that article, which makes it very clear that non-Muslim women are basically chattel for Muslim men to be raped anytime they can get them. And so once again, I showed how historically this was the case, which most people don't know, and I showed the doctrinal, backing of it. Muhammad saying this, or the Quran, basically the Quran legitimizing. Here, for example, is a quote from an American professor, Majid Khadouri, okay, and he was at Johns Hopkins, and he was a well-known professor of Islamic law, and he wrote this in his book, War and Peace and the Law of Islam, quote, "The term spoil, or ghanima, is applied specifically to property acquired by force from non-Muslims. It includes, however, not only property, but also persons, whether in the capacity of prisoners of war or as sabi, meaning women and children. If the slave was a woman, the master was permitted to have sexual connection with her as a concubine." And it's interesting because he writes in the past tense. He says, this was the case. Well, as we see, it wasn't just the case. It is the case. It is still going on today. So again, you know, that article that you bring up, Sex, Slavery, and Islamic Sacrament, the whole point of it and the whole point of what I'm trying to do is show you what's happening today has been happening continuously throughout history at the hands of Muslims who justified it as part of their religion, whether jihad or the sexual enslavement of infidels. And so it's not some new weird aberration, like I said, it's just another continuation of a history that Americans are largely ignorant of.
Well, and I sat in a class just 3 years ago with David Boris, a co-founder of Sharia Crime Stoppers, and the thing that just blew me away was this topic. So it's not just a European thing. We have 3,200 mosques or more in America. They are talking directly about this. And again, the notion that a non-Muslim woman uncovered could be seen as fair game by any of the millions of Muslim men who understand this background, understand this doctrine. I mean, this is an American crime problem, and yet we have been unable to communicate. Pardon for not lack of trying. Law enforcement has not heard this story. Thank God you got to the War College, but the law enforcement are basically unwilling or unable to deal with this topic in America. Yeah,
and you know, until we do, until we're forthright, you know, more and more people are. Like I said, you know, I'm thankful to all those who, you know, came on my behalf, for free speech about Islam. But as you can see, it's an uphill battle. This shouldn't have happened. It should not have been canceled in the first place. You know, I mean, and as you were pointing out, this is the War College. This isn't some left-wing, typical liberal university, you know, Berkeley or anything like that. It was the War College that actually did this. You know, happily, of course, they rectified it. But still, that we're at that level of, you know, this knee-jerk response or anything critical of Islam and Islamophobia, everyone cancels and shuts down, is not very heartening.
And it does involve Sharia-sanctioned crime. And again, that same energy that got behind the movement at the War College, we need that to continue on the local level so that local city councilmen are inviting their police chief to schedule training where they can do a better job of protecting women. All right, another article here. This is one of your monthly, if I understand. This is part of the program I think you've talked about since 2011. You do a monthly summary.
Yeah, my Muslim Persecution of Christians report, which comes out by the Gatestone Institute every month. Yeah. Basically, what I do is every month I compile a report summarizing, you know, the more egregious anecdotes that surface for that month of Muslims persecuting Christians all around the world.
Well, and you go into great detail. You talk about individual atrocities against communities, and you name the country. You provide detail. You talk about atrocities against churches. It's just incredible to see the content month after month after month, all these years. And again, you would think, well, no, you wouldn't think anymore that anybody, mainstream media would pick this up, so it's up to us as individuals to follow this conversation, follow this by looking at these articles that you produce every single month. Yeah,
and when I started that particular series, you know, I started it in 2011, summer of 2011. So we're going almost on a decade. And the idea, like I said, was every month to compile what Muslims had done in a report. And I remember thinking to myself before I began this venture, you know, how feasible it was, because what if a month came and there weren't many? What if there was only one or two? I can't write a report about one or two things, but lo and behold, you know, nearly a decade later and 100 reports later, they've only gotten bigger and longer to the point that I don't include everything I come across, and that's what's reported. Then there's all the stuff that's not even reported. So you know, if you look at it, the stuff that happens that's in that report, if it was a Christian or a non-Muslim in general or a Jew doing this to a Muslim, it would be all over the mainstream media and it would be a big story. But because of its nature, you know, who the victim is and who the persecutor is, it just doesn't get mentioned. It's just you know, not a news item, and that itself I think is very telling. And that's one of the reasons why I'm motivated to continue compiling them as a testament against you know, this widespread indifference and worse.
So as part of the one team, we're going to invite all of our attendees to follow this information and talk about it, get other people to see this information that's provided each month, as well as the other articles. We've got one more to talk about real briefly, if you would. COVID-19 is a massive topic, of course. Tell us a little bit about this article, Islamic Hygiene Prevents COVID-19, question mark?
Well, lots of Muslims, at least at the time when I wrote that article, were reveling in the fact that COVID-19 seems to be a non-Muslim disease. So it's affecting Chinese, it's affecting Europeans, it's affecting Americans. So the argument, as usual, is that's because they're infidels and we're good Muslims, and because we follow Islamic law and the teachings of Muhammad, that's why we're not getting it. And they were citing the fact that Muslims engage in what's called wudu, or ablutions, before they pray. You know, the customary ritual washing that they do before any prayer every day. So they were saying that was instilled by Allah precisely so we don't get this kind of disease. And you see, if you're a good Muslim and you do what you're supposed to do and pray and therefore wash, you won't get it. And then, you know, and all this sort of thing about how Muhammad said this in the hadith and Muhammad said that. So the point of my article was to actually look at some other things that Muhammad said in the hadith that a lot of Muslims would not want known about hygiene. And a lot of it is frankly very anti-hygiene. You know, things like, you know, Muhammad, there's records of him, and these are authentic hadith, sahih, meaning Muslims, Sunni Muslims at least believe them. Muhammad, for example, spitting out phlegm and his followers rubbing it on their face. Muhammad basically telling people that Allah loves sneezing and he hates yawning, which has led to a culture that, you know, if someone sneezes, that's great. It's like a wonderful little wet mist you can walk into that Allah loves, even though it spreads disease. Whereas yawning, which has no bearing on health, is something to be shunned. And really, you know, speaking of COVID and coronavirus, if you go back to, I think, 2011 or 12, another strain of it plagued Saudi Arabia. And I think that one, actually, I don't think actually scientists determined it was based on camels. So humans got it from camels. And its mortality, its death rate was much worse. It was 40% of those who got it actually died. And it's funny because, well, it's not funny, it's sad, but Muhammad also taught his followers to drink camel urine for its salutary benefits. And so it seems clear that they got it because of an Islamic teaching that told them to drink urine from camel urine, even though that particular coronavirus, I think it's called MERS, MERS, was traced back to camel. So it was just, that article was, you know, meant to show the sort of hypocrisy amongst certain Muslim groups and elements who were basically gloating at a time of really tragedy around the globe.
Well, we're going to do some work with the questions if we can. One question that we get frequently, and I invite you to answer, given your work and your view of the world, and I know that your scholarly work, certainly as an American citizen, you must have some comment. How would your work be impacted, as well as the rest of us, if Donald Trump is not the president next year?
Well, you know, I mean, we've seen how it's been impacted by under the likes of, you know, Obama. And we've seen, for example, how for example, after CARE, well, let's put it this way. I don't even know if the War College would have invited me if, let's say, we were under an Obama and not under a Trump. And so CARE wouldn't have had to even protest because I might not have been invited, or maybe they will. You know, I'm just guessing. But after the cancellation and the hysteria, you know, keep in mind, for example, the National Association of Scholars sent their letter to the White House. If that was another president, specifically the former one, it would have just been torn up and thrown in garbage. And I've actually heard from people, insiders, I don't know how legit this is, but that actually Donald Trump was involved in this, and the White House did respond at some level or capacity. So I definitely think it's that, you know, compared to other presidents, and not just Obama, Trump definitely is a breath of fresh air when it comes to this topic. He said you know, some things that no president would ever really say. He even said, there's something about Islam, it hates us, which actually is a doctrine. And I wrote a whole piece about how he was more right than he knew, because Islam does teach Muslims to hate non-Muslims. And it's founded in the Quran, Surah 60, verse 4, basically, where, you know, Abraham or Ibrahim was called upon, he had to hate his relatives, and various other teachings by Muhammad in the Hadith and so forth. So I think it's good having this president in the context of free speech vis-a-vis Islam. I think it's good having this president in the context of many things, actually. And hopefully this sort of thing, because there will come a time, whether he wins or not in re-election, that Donald Trump will be gone. And I just only hope that we don't go back to, square one in our next president, whether it's now or 4 years from now, ends up being another Obama. And yet I have serious fears that I think that is what will happen.
Well, let's just speak for a moment, whether it's Biden or Bernie or
Sanders.
whoever, or whoever jumps in. By the way, we keep hearing about now the governor of New York and maybe the governor of Michigan, who happens to be a woman. In any event, we could just look at, as you do in your book, at facts. So Obama went to Egypt. He went to the university in Egypt and spoke directly and apparently wanted the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Egyptian creation in the 20s, to hear his message. As you look at the Muslim Brotherhood in America, how bad is it in your mind? We've had other people give us their opinions. How bad is the penetration by the Sharia compliant people, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood, the political party called Islam? It's really a political party as well as military. How bad is it in your mind in terms of saturation?
I think it's pretty bad. And, it's very subtle. It's hard to determine who. If a person is a Muslim, right there, the seeds are there. And they don't even have to be card-carrying care members or, Muslim Brotherhood members. It's almost instinctive amongst the Muslim. If you're living amongst non-Muslims and you're in a position of power, well, you're going to be an apologist for Islam, and you're going to be a polemicist against people like me who speak the truth. It's just like it's just natural without even them trying consciously to do it. And maybe just as bad, if not worse, is the fact that so many regular non-Muslim Americans have been infected by this sort of this apologetic / polemic worldview where they knee-jerk defend Islam and knee-jerk attack anyone who says anything that can be construed as negative about Islam. So I think that, in a way, the culture itself is infected. So it's not, while the actual idea that, CARE itself as an organization is very legitimate and cause for pause, I agree with that. I think it's metastasized and has become a culture even amongst unsuspecting people who don't even care about CARE or know about CARE. But they just develop this, we have to protect Islam because if you don't, you're a racist. And we have to show how, all the things that I'm saying are false and so forth. And I think that's in many ways the greater problem because it's become just part of it's political correct speak. If you want to be a successful politician or a successful whatever in the public eye, that's how you have to talk. And that's how you have to become. You have to be a little CARE member, even though you don't know it. And I think that's something that definitely needs rectifying.
Well, I think that says a lot. And as you may know on this program, and Tom Trento was the head of the United West, talked about it all the time. The people that have the most to lose here are the evangelicals, the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians who still read the Bible, and that's their life, and they're evangelicals. They may think that they could stay home. Well, in fact, if they do stay home and they don't come out and they don't understand what's at stake, it's very probable that the president will not be Donald Trump, and these repeated terrible things that happen that you talk about in your book certainly can happen in America, whether it's individual Sharia crime or, God forbid, the end of the country because of the Marxists and Islam. Islamists, certainly the Sharia folks, think that the Sharia should be the law of the land, not the Constitution. So we've got a question about your book. Somebody said they went to Amazon and they can get the audio version, but they'd like to get the hard copy book. They didn't see it there. What's the best way to get the hard copy of your book?
Well, the hard copy should be there in Amazon. I'm on Amazon right now. If you look, there's there's various options. There's Kindle, there's audio, there's paperback. Paperback will be released, I think, in a few months. Still not out, but the hard copy is showing in front of me. Should be there.
We just wanted to clarify that. Well, we're gonna invite you to give us 5 minutes to do some administrative work, Raymond, about what's coming, and then we're going to ask you for a final word. This has been extraordinary. You have a background that I do think is divinely impacted. The Georgetown to the Congress, Library of Congress is pretty amazing, and you've made the most of it. So thank you, Raymond Ibrahim, very much. We ask you to stand by for just a couple minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could. We always talk about action items, and our first action item is to continue to associate with Raymond. You've got a Twitter handle, I believe. I hope it's right, at Raymond Ibrahim 5. Is that it?
Yeah. Yep.
And the website, RaymondIbrahim.com. Please take the actions and then share that information. That would be extremely important in the remaining. I think we're just about, 220 days to go for this election. Part of the election certainly should be impacted by the research that Raymond does. The other action item is, we talked about it before, there is an organization called the Army for Trump. The United West is working very hard to get people in its sphere of influence to join the Army for Trump. You go online, you'll find all kinds of ways you can contribute to that. Again, frankly, it's just a notion that without, if someone other than Donald Trump is the president next year, Sharia crime in America will increase, and that affects all of us as well as the country as a whole. Talking about the Army for Trump, I want to make a point. Tomorrow is Wednesday, and we have, some of you are watching on YouTube, the United West YouTube account, as well as on the homepage of the UnitedWest.org. Tom Trento is our director. Our theme for this year is Make America Think Again. Tomorrow morning in the 11 o'clock hour of the radio show is somebody calling in from the Trump campaign. So every Wednesday at 11:15, we hear from the Trump campaign directly, being interviewed by Tom Trento. They will talk about the Army for Trump. So if you're interested, this would be a reason for you to join us at 11 o'clock tomorrow. You can join by going through the webinar link. You can join by going to the UnitedWest.org homepage, and you'll see right there on the homepage, you'll see a YouTube broadcast of Tom's remarks. Tom's remarks at 11 o'clock are already going out to a radio show in Florida. That'll continue. If you're motivated, at 10:30, you can join Tom Trento for a Bible study. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Yeah, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday this week, Tom will be speaking about the existence of God. Tom is a trained apologist and has degrees from Bible colleges in the United States. So he's well equipped to do a Bible study followed by news analysis. Oh, by the way, there's a few laughs in the 11 to 12 o'clock hour. I can attest to that. Again, it's on the UnitedWest.org homepage, the podcast, or on the YouTube page of the United West. So what else is going on? By the way, just want to make a point. We are so grateful to you as an audience. The webinars have been so successful that between yesterday and May 1st, we, the United West Sharia Crime Stoppers, are doing 32 webinars. So people are home, daytime and nighttime. In terms of the nighttime, we're going to continue to bring you some superb news and analysts. We're super excited to let you know that Claire Lopez and Christine Douglas-Williams will continue with us in rotation. Well, we're adding a new person, and that would be Leo Holman. He's been with us in other webinars. Leo Holman publishes at leoholman.com, and he will be speaking on April 6th at 7 o'clock on our webinar. I'm pretty sure he's going to be talking about technocracy, the whole notion of all of these experts who are not elected providing technical input, which in the hands of leftists, we lose our freedom. So a news analysis program every Monday night through April and May. What you'll notice is that the Tuesday webinars we're not doing in April and May, among other reasons, because there's so many other things for you to do locally or with the Army for Trump. So keep in mind, our Monday nights will continue. We have a fourth Thursday webinar with Mark Christian, but we also have daily webinars at 10:30. You can see them at the UnitedWest.org. A friend of ours has jumped on the Zoom webinar wagon out of necessity. This is events that were supposed to happen in Minnesota. They're happening instead on Zoom. It's a separate registration. I want to be careful. If you look at this, this is, of course, Shahram Hadian, and he's talking about specific topics, biblical studies, as well as his work on Islam and national security. You have to go to a special place to register. That would be his tillproject.com. So you will not get access to that through us, but I wanted you to at least to know it's the same technology. Go to Truth and Love, tilproject.com, and you'll find out about how to keep up with Shahram. That would be Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of this week. With the United West, we keep somehow doing this on a shoestring. If you feel so motivated, please remember us as you look at donations. And back to Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, we are so grateful that you've given us all of this background. You've basically given us an insight in terms of what the War College heard from you for over an hour. And that's a gift for us to know what our military leaders were trained by you, what should be in their heads. So I invite you to give us whatever you think would be appropriate as a closing comment.
Well, in regards to the question of Islam in general, obviously, if you're someone who's following, your broadcast, seems obviously they know what's up with Islam and they understand the threats that it causes. But anyone who's still not sure or on the fence or wishes to be armed with, the ironclad facts of what Islam said to and did in the West, or did to the West from a historical point of view, I'd suggest just getting the book Sword and Scimitar to arm yourself with it, because like I said, most of the words are not my own. They're quotes, a lot of them from primary sources, from Muslims, from contemporary Europeans who lived during those times. So I think that's very eye-opening and definitely supplements, if not overpowers, the doctrinal argument that's based on what Islam, what the Quran says, what Muhammad says. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And it's important to spread that message. So seeing what happened at the War College, you can see that the Islamists, the activists, the cares of the world don't want this information spread. So if you can share it with others, that would be great. Opening some eyes, because you can't argue against history. You can argue about theology, you can argue about doctrines, but when it comes to what happened, you can't argue with that. And I think that's why these groups like CARE don't want this out in the open, because there's no way they can win that argument. And just in general, keep an eye out for the enemy, because they are subversive and they do worm their ways into various institutions and groups and appear as your friend. They appear as the moderate, the nice guy. And this is not to say there is no such thing, but it is to say also to be on guard, to be prudent with what you encounter and what you understand. That's it.
Thank you, Raymond Ibrahim. Wonderful contribution to our audience. We appreciate it. Again, this is about physical, actual things that happen in history. One could project, if somebody was to look at history in 2050 and look back at 2020 and the years of the next 3 or 4 years, what would the history writers look back and see? Again, not in terms of doctrine, but in terms of actual history. We think we're in World War III. We think that it is both a spiritual and a kinetic battle. You are the warriors in terms of influence, operations, and helping people understand it. And you've got a very specific battle in 2020. It's called the 2020 election. And we invite you to keep arming yourselves. And we certainly appreciate your cooperation this evening as well. So thank you, Raymond Ibrahim, and thank you all the attendees. Good night, Raymond.
Thanks, Dick. Good night.